Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age podcast, interview episode, The Flight of Seleucus and Dynastic Propaganda with Angus Jacobson. Hello everyone, today I have the pleasure of welcoming onto the podcast Angus Jacobson, a PhD candidate with the University of Tasmania. His research focuses on the relationship between the Seleucid and Antigonid dynasties during the early Hellenistic period, and he has joined us on the show to talk about just that. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here, and a long time aspiration as well.
Well, I'm glad to hear, and could you tell the audience about your background and maybe what the focus of your research is exactly all about beyond the two dynasties?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, I am a PhD student from the University of Tasmania, that small little island off the south of Australia that no one really knows about. It's sort of mysterious, sort of like Narnia of Australia. But what I focus on is the relationship between the Seleucids and the Antigonids in the early Hellenistic age. So what that means is I trace the relationship between those two dynasties from the flight of Seleucus, which we're talking about today, to the death of Antigonus Gonatas, where the alliance sort of falls apart a little bit. And then after a brief intermission, it comes back. But given the scope of my thesis, it needs to be set to that period. But essentially what I'm looking at in regards to this alliance is how the two dynasties used alliances as a mechanism of power. So how they controlled their empire. So mostly it's an international policy focus, in a sense. It's looking at how the two dynasties used the alliance to control their empires, both internally and externally as well. And you might be wondering, how do we know about the alliance? People might have talked or seen references to the alliance at Rossus, which happens in the wake of Ipsus. Demetrius and Seleucus joined their houses in marriage through Seleucus's marriage to Stratonice. But many people may not know that Antigonus Gonatas, the son of Demetrius Poliocetes, and Antiochus I, the son of Seleucus, actually rejoined their houses, and there's another marriage. So Antiochus's daughter, Phila, marries Antigonus Gonatas, and then it happens again under Antiochus II and Antigonus again. There's another intermarriage between the families. So there's this sort of continual reestablishment of the alliance. And not many scholars have looked at it. So a lot of scholars have looked at it and gone, that's nothing to worry about, pretty much. It's not important. It has no bearing on the history, which is a big statement when you're looking at a period of history with very little evidence. My role in all of this is to untangle that and to say, well, actually, there might be an impact on the history. And this alliance, it's termed the oikiates, this kinship. And my role is to say that this kingship is very important. But I was not always bound for the Hellenistic world. I was, in my honours year, I was focusing on Julian II, who was a Roman emperor in late antiquity, better known as Julian the Apostate. And this is very, very in line with what we're talking about today, because Libanius was a very close friend of Julian II, and Libanius being the one who records the flight of Seleucus story that we're talking about today with Demetrius in it. This is sort of a love letter to my two passions in history and the transition from a late antiquitous into a Hellenistic scholar. It's using late antique evidence as a foundation for early Hellenistic history. So it's about 700 years between them, but it makes for a very interesting topic.
The early period of the Successors is a complicated web full of elusive chronologies, and while you've briefly touched upon the events of their encounters, can you give us a bit more of an insight regarding the developing relationship between the ascendant Seleucid and Antigonid dynasties at this time?
As your listeners would no doubt know, you're a little bit further beyond this now, but we're coming back and pulling you back to the start, back to the very beginning of the Successor age. This is in the wake of Alexander the Great's death. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, is not explicitly creating a kingdom, but he's building up this dynasty anyway. So he married his son Demetrius Poliocetes, the besieger, off to Phila, who was the daughter of Antipater. They're not really dynastic relations at this time, but they are going towards that direction now. It's a political marriage, and political marriages have always existed. So the Antigonids are, at this stage, the most powerful. I'm just going to call them dynasty for the sake of simplicity. But at this time, it's important to know that they weren't really a dynasty. They weren't really a kingdom, because Antigonus and Demetrius wouldn't assume the diadem until 306. So this is a 10-year period in between. I'm going to call them that for simplicity, but of course we have to bear in mind that at this time they were just Alexander's successors, his generals, governing the empire in his absence. At this time, Antigonus is the strategos, or the general of Asia. Seleucus is nothing more than a satrap. So he's rather unimportant at this point. And that's not to say that he's an unimportant figure. That's just to say that the role that he would come to play in later successor politics, as your listeners will know, is quite important and quite large compared to the others. Seleucus here is at the start of his career. He was a close companion of Alexander, and he fought with Alexander, of course. We don't know whether he fought with him during Persia, but it's safe to assume that he did. But he also fought with him in India, and we know that thanks to Arrian, the main source for that period. So Seleucus in 321 or 320, depending on the chronology that you look at, was gifted the satrapy of Babylonia, ostensibly for his role in taking down Perdiccas. From there, he showed his capability as a governor, and indeed, the Babylonian sources are very positive in their reception of him. There's a couple of random references to a time that he took some silver, but I think for the most part, these Babylonian chronicles, these cuneiform chronicles, are very positive towards him during this early period. The fact that they welcome him back, or so our literary sources say, we can't really ever trust them, but so they say. When Seleucus came back and retook Babylonia after his flight, he was welcomed with open hands and enthusiasm, and the locals even desired to join him. How much of that is true, we don't know, but it certainly matches up to how the early cuneiform tablets view him. So he's doing a very good job at the moment in Babylonia during this time. Antigonus and Seleucus don't really have much to do with one another until the war with Eumenes. And of course, this comes to a close in 316 with the death of Eumenes. And essentially at the end of that battle, he contributed troops towards Antigonus's efforts against Eumenes. And then Antigonus comes knocking. And this is when we first see this extended stay between the Antigonids and the Seleucids. So Seleucus hosts Antigonus and he comes in, which sets up the scene for the flight of Seleucus. He comes in and he must have stayed a couple of months at least. Demetrius is with him. So this is the first real encounter between these ascending dynasties.
The flight of Seleucus, when Seleucus flees Babylon to the refuge of Ptolemy in Egypt after Antigonus threatened to execute him, seems to be the central event in their royal propaganda. Can you elaborate more on this event and how it became so relevant to the Seleucid foundation myth?
The flight of Seleucus, we can more or less place it to the end of 316 now. Most of the sources are pretty consistent in their dating. There was a time when Diodorus Siculus, who of course is mostly building upon Hieronymus, originally was dated to 315, but now he's been comfortably redated to 316. His chronology is just a mess. But luckily, in this case, all of the sources are pretty much in agreement. So they normally place it to late 316 or early 315 in Babylon. But I think that it's probably closer to 316 thanks to this Babylonian chronicle BM 35920. Doesn't have a very creative name, but it's a late 4th century cuneiform tablet, which actually references Seleucus's flight in late 316. Although there is some dispute around that as well. Effectively, what we're looking at here is there is a dispute that arises between Seleucus and Antigonus, which leads Antigonus to force Seleucus to flee. So Seleucus flees, and depending on the source that you're looking at, there's many different versions. The version that we're going to focus on today, which is the version of Libanius, says that Seleucus was actually saved by Demetrius. So the son of Antigonus helped him and warned him and said, be away with yourself before my father kills you. And that's quite interesting, but we'll get into that more. But Libanius's version and Diodorus's version very similar to one another, actually, because they both say that Monophthalmus did this because of a jealousy, a grievance with Seleucus. At this stage, Seleucus and Demetrius must have been in Babylonia together for at least 4 months. Diodorus and Libanius say that Antigonus had by now developed this thonos, is the Greek word that Libanius gives to it. It's essentially an grievance. They don't really give a reasoning behind why this developed, although Libanius does say that it's because Seleucus was so popular and because he was really effective in the war against Eumenes, which he was. He did help Antigonus quite a lot. So we're looking at some truth in Libanius's account here. And essentially, Diodorus says the same thing, except there's this elaboration on this point where Antigonus asks Seleucus to provide some accounts and Seleucus refuses. So Antigonus wants to look at his finances. We don't actually get the reasoning behind this. And that's led some to say, well, maybe this is a false pretense to exile Seleucus anyway. He's becoming too popular with the Babylonians and he's becoming too popular as a general. So why doesn't Antigonus just make up something to get rid of him? And that's seen in both Libanius and in Diodorus. So clearly Libanius was building off Diodorus's account, or even an account that Diodorus was using. So that's the joy of the Hellenistic age, where we have to look at not only the sources, but the sources of the sources and the sources of the sources of the sources. We do have other accounts of the encounter between Antigonus and Seleucus. In Appian, in his Seleucid digression in the Syriacae, he says that Seleucus oversteps his authority by insulting one of Antigonus's officers. And this is quite interesting because there's still the demanding of the accounts, but it's as a response to Seleucus. So Seleucus is becoming a bit haughty in Antigonus's eyes. He's overstepping his authority a little bit. And as a punishment, Antigonus wishes to have a further look into Seleucus's government to ensure that he's not conspiring against Antigonus, pretty much. And Seleucus once more refuses, which leads to his flight. And there are also some other little mentions of the flight, such as in Pausanias. But it's such a condensed account that we can't really trust it for anything because it says that Seleucus fled Babylon. He goes to Ptolemy, and he returns to Babylon to kill Antigonus and capture Demetrius. And it's really quite condensed, and it can't be trusted. Seleucus flees to Egypt. And this is where the sort of importance of the story comes in for the dynasties. It has these soterial connotations, so it's to do with salvation and this savior image. The savior image was incredibly important to the Hellenistic dynasts. Most of them adopted the name Soter, so savior, and it was to do with their actions in saving certain peoples. Ptolemy is given the name Soter for his help of the Rhodians in 306, and Demetrius and Antigonus also hold this title as well. So it's important to all three dynasties involved in this story if we believe Libanius's story that Demetrius was actually involved in it. And so Ptolemy is the one that saves Seleucus directly because Seleucus flees to Egypt and Ptolemy accepts him as his guest. And in return for this favor, Seleucus will serve out an extended period as Ptolemy's admiral, which is something that people don't really know, is that during this period from 315 to 312, when Seleucus was residing with Ptolemy, he was serving as an admiral and actually campaigning against Antigonus under Ptolemy's command. So in this story, it's Ptolemy that's the main savior, but also if in the Demetrius Soter tradition, as I call it, which is the Libanius story, you actually have Demetrius fulfilling the role of a savior as well through his actions in warning Seleucus and leading him away. It shows that he is also a savior, which leads us to believe that we're dealing with a completely different tradition here, one that's separate from the Ptolemy and Seleucus tradition, which is beneficial to all the dynasts, which is quite interesting. And so it really becomes central to not only the Seleucid foundation myth, it also becomes central to the Antigonids, because who allowed for the creation of the Seleucids? Demetrius. And for the Ptolemies, the same. Who allowed for the creation of the Seleucids? The Ptolemies. They're pretty much claiming a part in the foundation of the Seleucids. which is really quite interesting. There's this battle over mythology, and it's one of those really interesting things that happens throughout the Hellenistic age, where you can see these competing myths about the foundation of the dynasties. But here we know that this is actually a true story. Well, the basics of it are true. That Seleucus fled from Antigonus to Egypt. We know that much is true because not only are all the sources consistent, but also we have that Babylonian chronicle, which actually lists his escape. But of course, the Libanius version itself is quite significant because if it is in fact true, and it really seems to reflect similarities to the Diodorian narrative, but if it is true, then on one hand, it could suggest that there was a friendship between Seleucus and Demetrius, this admiration that pre-existed the rise of their dynasties. So before they even decided to join their houses together in the wake of Ipsus. And now obviously there were other things contributing to that decision after Ipsus to ally themselves together. But if this story about Demetrius saving Seleucus from his father is in fact a real story, a real tradition that Libanius is building on, then what we're looking at here is Seleucus and Demetrius are best friends. Probably not quite that, but there certainly would be enough time there for them to build a relationship during those months. I would say that there's a likelihood that they could have done that. Seleucus was something of a legend for someone like Demetrius. He had fought alongside Alexander. He was one of Alexander's closest confidants in his final years. And if we know anything about Demetrius, it's that he looked up to Alexander. To have someone at his disposal that he could go and talk to about Alexander during this 3-month stay that he had at Babylon, it's quite likely that Demetrius would have taken up that opportunity and perhaps even formed a relationship with him. And of course, that's purely speculative. But it goes in favor of Libanius's story, and it gives us more profound reasoning for the alliance as well. It's not just an alliance built on this necessity in the face of Lysimachus and Ptolemy joining their houses together. It's actually a friendship, a kinship that they had before then that was established during their time together in Babylon. Libanius either could be preserving a real tradition here, which reflects real events, or he's preserving a tradition which is built on the actual propaganda of the joining of these two houses. Propaganda that was established during the time that Seleucus and Demetrius were allied together, which, depending on how you look at it, could be anywhere from 3 years to 15 years. And I think the emerging understanding is that this alliance between Seleucus and Demetrius actually lasted a lot longer than Plutarch lets on, and that it lasted until 286 when Demetrius invaded Syria and, of course, went against Seleucus. That's emerging in the scholarship as well, with scholars such as Altai Koskun. That sort of idea that Seleucus and Demetrius were allied for longer. So we have this longer period where they could have been promoting this type of story where Demetrius had saved Seleucus's life. And so it's quite essential to their actual propaganda, their foundational myth, their dynastic preservation as a result as well. But of course, Ptolemy's actual presence in the story narrows that time period that would allow for this being a result of Seleucid-Antigonid propaganda, because, of course, there was very few occasions where Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Demetrius were all on good terms with one another. And so the only time that I think is possible for this story to emerge, which is positive towards all three dynasties, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Antigonids, it must be placed during the period when Seleucus was mediating the marriage between Demetrius and Ptolemaeus, the daughter of Ptolemy. So this is in the wake of the marriage at Rossus. Seleucus directly begins to mediate the relationship between Demetrius and Ptolemy. So he's trying to improve it, and he's trying to play this mediator and this intermediary between the warring kings and bring them back together. It's during this period, I think, that a story like this could emerge. So we're looking at around 296, perhaps, that this Libanian tradition could emerge.
repeatedly made mention of Libanius of Antioch, who was born nearly 700 years after Alexander's death. But he also wrote about the history of Seleucus I, the founder of his mother's city. What do we know about Libanius, and what does an author from late antiquity matter to us with regards to the events of the 4th century BC?
We actually know a fascinating amount about Libanius. We're very fortunate to have a hell of a lot of sources preserved by him. And he actually has more letters and works in total preserved than Cicero. So he's a more prolific writer than Cicero, and that's already saying something. So in total, we have over 1,500 letters preserved by him, and well over 100 other oral speeches, such as orations, including some in honor of Julian the Apostate, who was the emperor from 360, or Augustus from 361 to 363 until his death in Persia. And we have some other things such as declamationes. And essentially, Libanius was a native to Antioch, which is why he's writing his speech, the Antiochicus, which I'll get into more in a second. But he was a native to Antioch during the 4th century CE. As you say, this is a significant amount of time after the period that we're looking at here, which shouldn't really come as a surprise to us as enjoyers of Hellenistic history, because most of our sources are from the later period. And really, Libanius comes in between earlier stuff in the 2nd century and 1st century, and the later stuff, which is preserved by these Byzantine scholars or Eastern Roman scholars, such as Photius or Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos, who is another scholarly emperor, much like Julian, actually. And he preserved many of our fragmentary sources, and especially the fragmentary parts of Diodorus's later books as well. But Libanius comes in between those. In essence, it's not that strange to be looking at a source such as Libanius. He's affected by his agenda, obviously. So his Antiochicus was delivered in 354, likely, upon his return to Antioch. For a time, he went to Athens, he was taught at Athens, and then he served under the court of Constantius II, who was the cousin of Julian, who would become his idol due to his attempts to restore Greco-Roman polytheism. He goes to Constantinople, where he serves under Constantius II, and then in 354, he decides to return to Antioch. It just so happens that 2 years after his return in 354, there is an Olympic Games held in Antioch. In an Olympic Games, you have a speech to praise the games themselves. Libanius has this honor. So he has the honor of writing the Antiochicus, as it has become to be called, otherwise known as Oration 11, depending on which sorting of the orations that you use. And it was delivered in 356 at the Antioch Games. So this is 2 years after his return. And here he would stay in Antioch until his death in 393 and play an incredibly important role. And we shouldn't doubt that he had access to imperial records as well, especially to do with Antioch. But the Antiochicus itself is quite interesting because it's this speech which, as I said, is meant to conform with Olympic speech conventions. It's meant to praise the Olympic Games, which it does in a few respects. It praises the location where the Olympic Games are being held. But most of the time, it's set on praising Antioch. So it's actually city praise as opposed to these Olympic speeches. One of the main things that he tries to do during this speech is promote Seleucus as the founder. And he has this intention of comparing Seleucus as the founder of Antioch, the greatest city of the late Roman Empire, to the founder of Athens, who, of course, is Theseus. The significance of the city is contingent on the significance of Seleucus, so how important Seleucus is. For a large portion of the speech, Libanius has a Seleucid digression, much like Appian, except he's praising Seleucus. And we can tell that he's purposely distorting events. For instance, he removes Antipater from Triparadisus in 321 or 320 and says that it was the Macedonians, in fact, that gave him the right to rule over Babylon. It's a rule by the choice of his countrymen as opposed to the decision of Antipater. Also, he removes his role in Perdiccas's death. Essentially, what we're seeing is Libanius, through his desire to promote Antioch, is promoting Seleucus as this new Alexander, essentially. And he even goes as far to say that he is as great as Alexander, which is a bold claim, really. but some people might agree that he was. He's going as far to say that, look, he's the one true heir to Alexander's empire, but he is also the heir to Heracles, which is interesting. And also he is the equivalent of Theseus. So he's linking him in with all of these mythical figures, if you can consider Alexander a mythical figure as well, which he is in essence. There is such a large mythology around his life, and where things become very difficult to tear fact from fiction. Heracles, I mentioned that's a completely different matter, but this must be another tradition that Libanius is building on here, where Seleucus claimed descent from Heracles, trying to build up his mythological foundations, adding that legitimacy to the Seleucid dynasty. So we can already see here that Libanius has purposely picked out these different traditions which are very positive towards Seleucus, which is a nice change, I suppose, because there's many anti-Seleucid distortions throughout the narrative that we have, even in Diodorus, because all of the sources are focusing on Ptolemy and Antigonus and the Antigonids, especially through Hieronymus. We lose track of Seleucus a lot. So it's nice to have this source in the late 4th century, which records this story and adds Demetrius into it. If we can believe sources such as Photius, who rely on contemporary sources to these events, here, why shouldn't we trust Libanius, who is evidently has access to all of these sources and all of these traditions, as someone who's well established not only in the Roman imperial court, but also in Antioch as well. And if anywhere is going to have information on Seleucus's rise, be it fictional, mythological, or otherwise, it's going to be Antioch as the metropolis of the Seleucid kingdom. Libanius must have been building on those sort of things, and he includes many hints to these traditions that he's including throughout, which is quite interesting.
If we follow the works of Appian and especially the biographer Plutarch, Demetrius is said to have warned his comrade Mithradates of his father's impending betrayal, allowing Mithradates to flee and eventually start his own kingdom in Pontus. Libanius, on the other hand, seemingly inserts Seleucus into the story instead. Can you explain the discrepancy between these two seemingly contradictory accounts? In your opinion, how does it reflect the dynastic politics of the early Hellenistic period?
Yes, or does Mithridates insert himself and Demetrius into a Seleucid story? It's one of those things. We have this story which has Mithridates Katistes as the one that's being saved, and it's so strikingly similar to the Seleucid story. The Seleucid flight in general, it's so similar. But of course, the major thing is that while the Seleucid flight story doesn't have Demetrius most of the time, apart from Libanius, the Mithridatic story consistently has Demetrius. For instance, Plutarch includes the story both in his Moralia and also in his biography of Demetrius. In his biography of Demetrius, he says that Demetrius was saved by Mithridates, who was his companion at the time. And essentially, Antigonus has a dream that Mithridates is cultivating a field of gold and that he's effectively going to build this great kingdom. And Antigonus gets jealous. So we can see that continued jealousy. There's the jealousy in the Seleucid story as well, but also in the Mithridates story. And essentially, Demetrius finds out about this and goes, oh, my dad's going to kill my best friend. And he goes and warns him, and he writes in the sand. We actually get the message in this story, which is quite nice. He writes in the sand, Fuge Mithradata, which means fly Mithridates. Looking at this, there's been a couple of interpretations, such as that from Pat Wheatley, who suggested that this is actually taking place in 314. So after the flight of Seleucus, though he does not mention the flight of Seleucus, which is quite interesting. He proposes that this is taking place in 314. So there are some people that believe that this is the true source and the true narrative of events. Both Libanius and the Plutarchian version, which is repeated more or less in Appian, but without Demetrius, have these similarities throughout, which makes it seem like they are both the same tradition, but there are changes to it. And we wonder why that would be so, why there is a Mithridatic version of a Seleucid flight myth, or if you prefer the other argument, why is there a Seleucid version of a Mithridatic flight myth? When you're looking at the evidence, Plutarch has many reasons to include the Mithridates version. one of the reasons, which could still apply to the Seleucus version, is that he wants to show this at the start of Demetrius's life, that he has philanthropia, which is a goodwill, that he was born with it, and that during this early stage of his life, Demetrius was, of course, in his 20s, that he was able to use it to save such a great person's life. And we wonder why he didn't, if the Seleucus tradition existed at the same time as Plutarch, then why he didn't choose to use that one. And perhaps he just saw it as fitting more with his actual narrative. You really have to look at what the other sources say about Mithridates' flight from the Antigonids. What we look at then is Diodorus Siculus. He's the source that you turn to when in doubt. And Diodorus, of course, he doesn't record the flight. He doesn't say that Mithridates fled from Antigonus. In fact, he says that he rebelled against him. So in 302, just before the Battle of Ipsus, Cassander essentially has a masterstroke, a political masterstroke, and he says, I'm going to create disruptions within the kingdom of Antigonus. And so he employs the help of one of Antigonus's subordinates, Mithradates, who is the father or he is the uncle of Mithridates, depending on who you believe. Let's just say that it is the father for the sake of simplicity. Then Mithridates' father rebels from Antigonus. And this is what causes Antigonus to go after the younger Mithridates, so Mithridates Catistes, and to send him off eventually in flight to Paphlagonia, where he founds the Pontic kingdom. And there's many reasons why we should believe Diodorus's version over Plutarch's version, because if Plutarch's version is true, we have a period of 12 years where there is absolutely nothing done on Antigonus's behalf on pursuing Mithridates. And if he was such a great threat that he would actually believe a dream, and go after him and try to kill him, then would he not continue to pursue him? Would he not consider that would come back to bite him eventually? And that 12-year gap is just telling, really, that Diodorus perhaps has the right of it in arguing that only in 302, after the rebellion of his father, does Mithridates flee and eventually create the Pontic kingdom. And what is more is that in the Appian version that you mentioned, it's really quite interesting, because in the start, when he's mentioning the Mithridates flight story, and he says Antigonus was so jealous and because he had a dream and he went to kill Mithridates Catistes, but Mithridates Catistes fled. That's in the first part. And in the last part, he has this change of vocabulary. And he says that Mithridates Catistes founded his kingdom after revolting from the Antigonids. So not fleeing from the Antigonids, revolting from them. He uses this word, apostantos. So we get apostate from that, funnily enough. And that it means to revolt. So he's revolting from the Antigonids rather than fleeing from them. So there's even a confusion within Appian's source. And we look at it, and I looked at it certainly, and I said, hang on, Appian is confused here. He's confusing his sources. He has two different traditions. One where Mithridates Catistes fled from Antigonus early in his service, and then another where Mithridates Catistes revolted from him after the death of his father. So we have those two versions that are at odds with each other in Appian's own narrative. And that's just another reason that we should doubt the Mithridatic version. And so we might ask then, what's the chronology behind these events? Like, did the Seleucid version come first, or did the Mithridatic version come first? And there's been a little bit of work on this. We know for sure that the Mithridates version, this Mithridates flight tradition, is probably not based on Hieronymus, so on the Diodorian main source. So Diodorus would, of course, included this, perhaps. He was building on other sources, but if it was in Hieronymus, he would be more likely to include it. The argument there is that Hieronymus fought with Eumenes and Mithridates, so they were both on the same side under Eumenes during the war with Eumenes. So the argument is that, Hieronymus knew Mithridates under Eumenes, so therefore must have felt obliged to recount the rise of the Mithridatic kingdom. And I think that's just quite speculative. There's an Italian scholar called Primo, and he has essentially said that, well, Plutarch's account is drawing on a Pontic tradition, which distorts Hieronymus's account by conflating it with a Seleucid myth. the compatibility of Diodorus and Libanius' accounts, as I've said, and the lack of agreement between Appian and Plutarch's Mithridatic versions strongly favour Seleucus as the original recipient of Demetrius' salvation. This scholar has put in the effort to actually identify that Plutarch's version, which is building on a Mithridatic tradition, likely emerged after the tradition that Libanius is using. So we might ask then, well, why did he distort a Seleucid, an already existing Seleucid tradition? Remember, as I said before, that it likely is placed to 296 during the inter-alliance of the three dynasties there. We have to wonder why Mithradates chose to do it. Looking at the traditional chronology, the Pontic kingdom's founding and Catisti's assumption of kingship, so this is after his conflict with the Seleucids, it's traditionally dated to 281. However, thanks to the efforts of Altai Koskun, who has done some serious amendments to the chronology, he has redated Mithridates' reign to 283. This is quite significant because why would Mithridates adopt a story about his friend, his companion, Demetrius, saving his life and show that his story is the true version instead of the version with Seleucus? And that is incredibly important because 2 years before 283, Demetrius was arrested by Seleucus. And Demetrius is still in custody at this point. Because if it was 281, we have to wonder, why would Mithridates even appeal to the propagandic value of a dead king? But here, Polyacetes isn't dead. He's still alive. He's in prison. And no doubt he has many other supporters of the Antigonid cause still out there, in the Aegean especially. And by presenting himself as the original friend and the original recipient of Demetrius' salvation, he's showing that he is cause to follow, right? He is revenging the wrongs that Seleucus has done against Demetrius. It fits very well into the chronology because here Mithridates is about to go to war against Seleucus. Obviously, their kingdoms overlap. He's about to fight Seleucus. And this must have been very beneficial because he would have persuaded people over to his cause by showing that he was the original friend of Demetrius. And that's the reason why he actually adopted, or we can suspect that that's the reason that he actually adopted and distorted this version and placed himself in it. Conclusion then, we have this two competing traditions, as you mentioned, but the dissimilarities of the sources preserving the Pontic tradition are outweighed by the similarities and cohesion of the sources describing Seleucid flight myth. On one hand, we have this Seleucid flight myth that came probably 296 during a time when all of the parties were in good favour, so this propaganda tradition serves them all well. And then in 283, Mithridates, in an effort to boost his appeal to the disgruntled Athenians, adopts this story, distorts it, and places himself in it and broadcasts that as a sort of attack against Seleucus's legitimacy. Because this story was obviously important to Seleucid and Antigonid dynasties. So by removing Seleucus from it, he's damaging his actual reputation. He's taking him away from this vital foundational story. And that is, of course, quite significant. So first of all, this is showing that the alliance between Seleucus and Demetrius was more than occasional embassy to Miletus and the mediation of Ptolemy. It actually shows a conscious effort to craft a joint mythology. So this is completely excluding whether the story is true. It is still a tradition that is being used by Demetrius and Seleucus to promote their own dynasties, and therefore important to this post-Ipsus period of their alliance. And if it is, in fact, a tradition that reflects true events or semi-true events, as far as we can tell, it creates this more profound reasoning, as I said, for the kinship of Seleucus and Demetrius at Rossus. It, in fact, creates the reasoning that this was founded on admiration and philanthropia, so this goodwill that Demetrius showed towards Seleucus, that Seleucus, even after years and years of warring against the Antigonids, decided that his quarrel was with Antigonus and not with Demetrius, because it was Demetrius that saved his life. Now, of course, we can only speculate whether it is true or at least semi-true. Really, there are some events in the historical narrative that can be perfectly linked in with it, or very well linked in with it. Some even in Plutarch, who doesn't even include the story. It's not implausible that Seleucus and Demetrius had formed a friendship during Babylon, as I've mentioned before, but also in the later narrative, this friendship that they show at Rossus, if they had just been at war with one another, and of course this is in the wake of Ipsus, where Seleucus was indirectly responsible for the death of Demetrius's father, whom he was very close with. The Antigonids had this famous reputation for being a very close-knit family. He can't have taken that lightly. And it might be that he blames Lysimachus for it, because Lysimachus and Demetrius famously hated each other, but that's a whole nother story. And Demetrius and Seleucus, when they're at Rossus, have this immediate camaraderie where they're without arms and without guards publicly. So it's obviously a show. It's a demonstration of their friendship. They're doing it publicly so that people can see that they're no longer at war. But this cordiality is very significant because it's almost as if their friendship is far deeper than what it's shown to be in Plutarch. That prior to this, they had actually had contact with each other that wasn't just in war. And the relationship that is shown in this actual passage where they're at Rossus is similar to the relationship that Demetrius has with his father, as I mentioned, which is very, very interesting and contributes to the argument that this tradition could be true. But then also, when Demetrius is finally defeated and arrested in 285, it's quite significant because Seleucus remarks that it was not the good fortune of Demetrius, rather, that brought him safety, but his own, as in Seleucus's own fortune. And we look at that and go, what the hell is Plutarch talking about? Or what the hell is Seleucus talking about, But in fact, when it's detached from the Demetrius Soda tradition, this Libanian tradition, the fortune is quite obscure. We don't know what it is. It's ambiguous. But when it is attached, Seleucus is effectively saying that it is not Demetrius's ostensibly consistent luck which had once more saved him, but Seleucus's fortune, his own fortune, that Demetrius had thwarted his demise so many years ago. So it actually explains, in a way, the role of this Tuki, the role of this fortune that Seleucus is talking about in this episode. And that's quite significant. And that alone shows that perhaps Plutarch was aware of this actual tradition, the same tradition that Libanius uses, and just ignored it until he reached the end of Demetrius's life and had completely forgotten that he had actually included the Mithridatic version and not the Seleucid version. Very sloppy on Plutarch's behalf.
With that, I think that's a great place to bring our discussion to an end. I'd like to thank you once again for taking the time to share your insights with my listeners. And before I let you go, did you have any next plans with regards to your research, or is there anything you'd like to share with my listeners, like links, social media?
Yeah, I just want to stress once again, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk about my research in such a great place as well, and a long-time fan of the podcast. So it's really a dream come true to be here. As to my future research, of course, I'll be continuing with my thesis, and this, as I said, stretches well into the 3rd century until the death of Antigonus Gonatas. So my head's in the game for the following next couple of years. However, I will be around the place at conferences, hopefully publishing some papers in the future, and you can keep up with all of that on my academia, which is the social media, I guess you can call it, for academics. I presume Derek will provide that link to you, but if not, then it's Angus L. Jacobson, and you can just search that on academia. I've got 2 papers there at the moment, which I've presented at conferences, hoping to add a lot more to it.
Well, I will make sure to share Angus's academia links in the episode notes and description, so please do check those out. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. You've been listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast.